Hello YouTube, welcome back to Brunger Builds. Today, I'll be customizing a BARC Trooper helmet and building Commander Clay of the 36th Clone Battalion. Alright, for starters, the base of this build is a paid file by the Galactic Armory. I will link it, as well as all the materials I used, down in the description below. A few weeks ago, I was scrolling through Instagram and stumbled across this artwork by Talon Illustrations. After reading through his post description, I discovered that the original creator of this character was an artist by the name of Honnid. Honnid has been sketching Clay in various forms over the years, and recently had worked with Talon to develop his Phase 2 armor look. The BARC Trooper is one of my favorite clone armor styles, and because I had just done a Mimban Stormtrooper, seeing a similar blast shield used on top of a BARC Trooper helmet was intriguing to me. I reached out to Honnid, and he was gracious enough to allow me to build a physical prop using his designs. I also want to give a quick shout out to friend of the channel Fitz at Mapuzo Outpost for teaching me some Blender basics so that I could limp my way through removing the mohawk from the BARC Trooper helmet. The print ended up being a little rough on the dome, but nothing a little wood filler and elbow grease couldn't fix. I laid the wood filler on pretty thick since I knew that I'd need lots of material to make the dome nice and smooth. I removed most of the wood filler using 120 grit, and then worked my way up to 220 and 320 in a few places that I felt like needed a bit extra smoothing. And while I'm sanding, I feel like it's a good time to tell you that I sell posters on my Etsy shop. They're my take on a few vintage posters that were sold in the 80s at Star Tours, with a few originals thrown in there as well. Anyway, it's currently the best way to support the channel, so if you're interested, check them out. After the first round of sanding, I had to add a bit more wood filler to the dome, and then repeated the process. And then it was on to priming. Rust-Oleum offers two filler primers that I know of. One they call Filler Primer, the other is called 2-in-1 Filler Primer. I prefer their filler primer since it seems to dry a bit harder and is a lot nicer to wet sand. Here you can see I missed a few spots, and so I used a brush to dab the primer into the hard to reach areas. Next up, painting. For this, I used Rust-Oleum's 2X Satin White. To be honest, I have got to find a different white paint. I bought a big box of this a few months back, and so I'm just trying to use up what I have, but it is a terrible paint. It is somehow simultaneously runny and chalky, and even after warming up the cans before paint, it never sprays or lays the same way. I do not like this paint, and if you have any better suggestions, let me know in the comments. For the smaller bits, I used Rust-Oleum's 2X Satin Black, which strangely is one of my favorite paints, and always sprays very nicely. I gave the black pieces just a little bit of dry brushing using Vallejo's Duraluminum. Before I forget, I should mention that the blast shield and mounting lugs were custom designed by me in Blender. To give the mounting lugs just a little bit of extra detail, I used this nice little greebly bit that I found on Thingiverse. I actually use this model a lot in my builds since I feel like it's a simple but interesting shape. Initially, for the sake of speed, I decided to hand paint most of the detail areas on the helmet, but because I have such a shaky hand, I ended up needing to paint very slowly, and in the end, it probably would have been faster just to mask and airbrush. Before permanently fixing the blast shield to the helmet, I did a bit of pre-scratching. This was so that I could apply my liquid mask over these scratches and in the end be left with a more realistic paint chipping effect. I'm trying to get better at using liquid mask in a more restrained, fine detail sort of way, and so I used this tiny little wire to apply the liquid mask around the helmet. Like I usually end up saying, I think I went a little overboard on this step, but I'm still happy with the look. Something about the fact that I'm adding material instead of removing material makes it a bit harder for me to see what the final product is actually going to look like. I'm still pretty new at using liquid mask, and so I know that this is all just part of the learning curve when it comes to mastering a new technique. After I was done with the liquid mask, I moved on to adding the blue vent stripes. I used these 3D printed stencils as a guide, but I'll just tell you now, don't ever do this. I first laid down a coat of Vallejo's chipping medium and hoped that this would help seal the edges of the stencil, but because I could never get the stencil to sit truly flat against the helmet, I dealt with a little bit of paint bleed. It doesn't look too bad on camera, but in person it looked pretty bad. My solution was to first activate the chipping medium with some water and do my chipping, but then I let that dry for a whole day and then came back with 3000 grit sandpaper and carefully sanded at the edge of every line so that there was no more blue bleed left over. This was very tedious, but I'm very relieved that it worked. After this crisis was averted, I added a few more details, and then it was time to paint the battalion colors. The 36th Battalion's color is brown, but to add a bit of visual interest and to mimic the look that Honnid gives his artwork, I decided to go with a layering approach of 3 different shades of brown. Initially, I thought that I would use a sponge to stipple each layer on and create a bit of texture in the process. However, I quickly realized that the sponge was leaving far too thick of a texture that would be too exaggerated for the final product. So in a panic, I switched to a brush. But as I brushed, I also began to panic since I realized that the brush strokes weren't really reading as interesting texture and more reading as just amateur paintwork. So in a last-ditch effort, I broke out a small paintbrush and used that to stipple the surface of the paint while it was still wet. This left a much nicer, subtle texture, and I decided to commit to this look for the next couple layers. I started each new brighter layer while the previous darker layer was still wet. My goal was that all the layers would sort of blend together and that my stippling would never read as polka dotty or speckly, but instead the brown would just be a very nice, organic, inconsistent texture to look at. Once the paint had dried, I removed my liquid mask, and in my haste to assemble the helmet, I glued the blast shield to the helmet before I had masked up and painted the black brim around the helmet. This of course necessitated more hand painting that was more tedious and more time consuming than it would have been if I had just masked and airbrushed it. I glued in the mounting lugs for the blast shield, and then traced out a visor template, and then it was on to the final stages of weathering. The liquid mask had done a lot of the legwork on the dome of the helmet, but for the body of the helmet, I used a file to add some general scuffs and scratches on high points. I also couldn't help but feel that the liquid mask spots were still a bit too clean and unnatural, and so I went back with the edge of a file and some 60 grit sandpaper to add some more micro scratches to hopefully make everything look a bit more realistic. Next up was my standard black and brown acrylic wash. I say this in every video, but don't be afraid to use the cheapest possible acrylics you can find. I use apple barrel acrylics, which is like 50 cents a bottle. And my favorite step in this process is to use matte Mod Podge and pastel chalks to add a bit more gritty, dirty texture to the nooks and crannies of the helmet. This technique is really nice because you can spread the chalk out nice and thin and be left with a light, dusty texture, but if you really build up that chalk, you get a very nice, realistic, gunky texture. I'm almost always using some combination of black and brown chalk as my base layer, and then sprinkling in some greens or oranges depending on what I'm weathering. My final step was to flick a little bit of that acrylic wash from below the helmet to get a nice mud splatter effect. Now usually, this is where I would be finished with the project, but I realized that there was one last thing I needed to do. Off camera, I drew up this plaque in Photoshop to be mounted to the base of the helmet stand. Essentially, I just converted this black and white image to an SVG, which I could then extrude in Blender. If you'd like to learn how to do that, I highly recommend you check out this video and this video. I'll link them in the description. After the black paint had dried, I quickly dry brushed the plaque with some gold rub and buff, and then this helmet was ready for its glamour shots. If you made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching. This project was an interesting one. As a kid, I spent lots of time doing all manner of customizations to my clone action figures and Legos, and it felt very nostalgic to play a very tiny part in fleshing out somebody else's world that they've created. I hope Clay lives a long and happy life sat on Honnid's shelf. I highly recommend you check him and Talon out. They do great work. If you'd like to see more from me, make sure to subscribe, since I plan to drop a new video every Saturday. Thank you very much for watching. Have a good day.